Okay, we should be recording now. Recording should be in progress for those of you be aware of it. I'm going to go ahead and set up the screen share for the program for today. All right, today the program is about medicine in 1776 in honor of Independence Day, the first time that I'm aware of that we've had this conversation on this particular topic as part of the Grand Rounds. And when you go online to research, you can find information about medicine in colonial North America. It's particularly, this was hosted on Harvard. One of their academics had done a presentation about it. We'll cover some of the information from that presentation. But this will be available on Zoom, so you'll have the, will be recorded for YouTube, and you'll have the availability to find that link. But what an epidemic existed at the time. I mean, there was a lot of illness going on at that time. We talk about epidemics and pandemics and today, but at the time there were some serious diseases. And were those things preventable? Because as we've talked about in recent presentations about war and illness during war, and that's been something we talked about for Veterans Day and Memorial Day, it's very clear that if an army goes down for whatever disease, particularly in an epidemic, then you're going to lose your soldiers or your leadership. So what was it, and could they prevent it? Well, smallpox, as we know in North America, was an issue, and particularly for those that did not have any protection against it, the indigenous populations. But for Europeans, even though they had exposure back in Europe, are there approaches to counter the disease? Is there some kind of prevention in these pre-vaccine days? Well, they did have a sort of a version of a vaccine that was in use, even in use before North America, variolation, which they would use some live vaccine, introduce it, and that way only 1 to 2% of those that variolated died, as compared to 30% that died when contracting the disease naturally. So there's a particular link for the history of medicine, and you'll be able to find that one too if you just search for it on Google. And when we talk about smallpox, of course, I would assume that many of you know how bad that disease was. But we'll take a break here to talk a little bit more about smallpox and just the medicine in colonial America before we get into the medicine that is specific to the Army. But the infectious disease by the virus belongs to the genus Orthopoxvirus. And, it's been eliminated. There's been global eradication in modern times, but the initial symptoms were fever and vomiting, followed by ulcers in the mouth and a skin rash. And over a number of days, the rash turned into characteristic fluid-filled blisters with a dent in the center. And the bumps were scabbed over, fell off, leaving scars, transmitted to one person from another through prolonged face-to-face contact with an infected person, or rarely through contaminated objects. So it's not really an issue today, thankfully, but it was back then. But in colonial America, the issues of the day for the sicknesses and convalescence were, childbirth and contagions, and dying they were all ubiquitous events in colonial North America. I mean, there are factors of gender, race, and class that influenced the way in which Americans experienced these events. Thus, these academic collections, like, for example, from Harvard, can serve the needs of not just historians, but also scholars of urban history and the history of education, history of capitalism, environmental history, intellectual history, military history. So there's a lot of reasons to study this period of 1776. And the one from Harvard also showed a wealth of information on the history of professionalization among New England physicians, and the nature of colonial American medical education, because there was a 150-year transition of North American medicine away from the European traditions of knowledge toward practices that were unique to our own society and to our environment. So what about practicing medicine and being a patient? And these were sourced from that Colonial America article on smallpox. Colonial physicians served as important medical and intellectual authorities in frontier communities, but they were also businessmen. And as you read that particular resource, if you decide to go to that Medicine in Colonial North America link, you'll find that they used the correspondence that was sometimes in the form of account books, as physicians recorded the identities and complaints of their patients when they charged for the care, and it was a great resource for scholars. Patients had a much easier time finding physicians in urban centers like Boston. So let me continue with that thought in just a moment. But let's pause for ID. This is the Medical Amateur Radio Council, ran rounds on the internet. This is not a broadcast, but it's an interactive net with check-ins. And if there's anyone listening that, whether you're a Markham member or not, is not checked in yet, we want to give you the opportunity to be involved. So please check in at this time, make your call to AA4FL.
4FL, W1UJR. Alpha India 4, Tango Hotel. Thank you.
There's three of you. I got the W1UJR. Alpha Tango Hotel, go ahead again.
It was Alpha India 4 Tango Hotel. And for the last few minutes of your discussion, I was enjoying it.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're here with us, Alpha India 4 Tango Hotel. Yeah, please continue on. I think you'll find it to be very interesting. It's the first year in honor of Independence Day that we've had this discussion. I'm sure we'll build upon it. Every year, we're also doing the simulcast Zoom to make a YouTube video. There was a third station that was a little weaker. Would you like to check in, make a call? Okay, there's one additional station. Go ahead and make your call. Do we have any relays of additional stations checking in? Okay, we'll continue on with this throughout and have additional check-ins and take breaks for questions and such. Again, we're trying to make this as roundtable as possible through the use of the Zoom session. We're also able to, through the use of the Zoom session, we're also able to involve individuals that don't have HF equipment at home or don't have adequate antennas. So some of our members do not. At times of their lives they did. And we all go through the life cycles, and it doesn't always in sync with the solar cycle. It's a subject we've talked about. So we're glad to offer that extra adjunct or support for this lecture today. But picking up where we left off, we talked about urban centers like Boston being able to find physicians, but paying for medical care was expense that was afforded primarily by members of the growing professional class. So in Boston, you had a maritime economy to a high degree. So there are plenty of merchants, lawyers, wine, chair makers, cabinet makers, rope makers, shopkeepers, painters, sail makers, bakers. There certainly was the need, and the physicians there could fulfill it. And fortunately, in the big cities, there was a certain amount of ability to pay by cash. But when we talk about the rural areas and frontier medicine, totally different in colonial America. Even in colonial New England, outside of the cities, accepting in-kind payments from patients that dealt with food and agricultural staples rather than currency was a common occurrence. You might get paid in salt pork, rye, and labor in exchange for medical care. And similarly, there was one in Kittery, Maine, that was noted as being paid even in a linen handkerchief, brown sugar and butter. For those of you that don't know what Kittery, Maine is, it's just above the border there, north of New Hampshire, as you're going up I-95. I always joke in my family, because I mean, it's literally 10 or 15 minutes into Maine. I never got further north because my wife always had me stop at outlet malls that are leaving you there, which is actually not totally true, but a little bit of levity for today. But there was growing geographic spread of medical professionalism as well as flexible economic systems throughout colonial America. And we talk about the Revolutionary War, and soldiers their circumstances were a little bit different than the general population. Obviously, we're talking about battles. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the slides here. So was disease or battlefield injury a bigger issue? And for those that are not able to watch this live on Zoom, we'll be describing everything. You don't have to rely on what I'm reading off the screen as a guide. And disease was a major part of everyday life in American colonies, especially during the Revolutionary War. But on the soldiers who were dying of wounds more, 7 died of infections, including smallpox, malaria, and typhus, for every one that died in battle. There's a wonderful website from the American Revolution Institute.org, and they did a few videos even on YouTube that you'll be able to watch. So if you just look up the American Revolution Institute, you'll see where some of the material here that I'm talking about came from. And back then, doctors were influenced by ancient medical thought still, and even with the best of intentions, they were treating diseases with bleedings, with leeches, and purges. Now, there is a video program from the Institute called Saving Soldiers, Medical Practice in the Revolutionary War, and you'll be able to look that one up, and we'll be talking about some of the information that we discovered through that presentation, because they've taken that display that they had, uploaded the entire display to the internet. You'll be able to renew that. The close quarters of troops in the Continental Army added additional issues such as poor nutrition, and they were certainly in close quarters as well. So that's problematic, because dysentery and fever-producing diseases were common, and being the smallpox epidemic had a 30% death rate. I mean, that's pretty significant to any army. But the wound lethality over U.S. history, and we've covered this recently when we talked about Memorial Day, looking at all the different wars in the United States, and there was an era of disease, and then there was an era of injury. And that World War II seemed to be the cutoff where we started to move more away from disease. But during the Revolutionary War, depending upon the source, they were non-fatal wounds plus deaths, 10,633, but there were deaths of 4,435. That's a 42% lethality. I know that would be of interest to everyone, because that was a question about the medical care. Obviously, that wasn't enough to save individuals, and we'll talk a little bit more about what and why. The population of the colonies then was 2,500,000. But other sources say that there were 7,000 killed in battle during the Revolutionary War, but 17,000 soldiers succumbed to illness. So the proportion's a little bit different there. But battle wounds for the military doctor, they may only see 5% of their care for battle wounds. And that was right after battle, whereas 95% of the care was for disease. That particular Saving Soldiers program by the American Revolution Institute of the Society of Cincinnati, Washington, D.C., that document again is available. You can Google Saving Soldiers catalog for the American Revolutionary Institute and bring that up. There's a PDF. I don't remember how many pages. It was pretty extensive. I think you really enjoy reading the detail there, but we'll summarize that somewhat after we pause here for another ID. This is AA4FL for the Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds on the Air net. We run this net every Sunday at this time. We do it at 11 Eastern. We don't change with the time change. Somebody here just need to mute, check. Thank you for being on here. We have an additional check-in. KD4IZ with us. Thank you, Jack, for checking in. I've got you logged into NetLogin now. I'm about to ask for any additional check-ins at this time. You don't have to be a Medical Amateur Radio Council member. We'd love to hear from you. We check you in. There'll be an opportunity for questions. Again, this is not a lecture. This is not a broadcast. This is an internet. This is an interactive net with all our members. We're giving some of the background information before we open it up for the discussions. Make your call to AA4FL to check in.
Whiskey, 9 Foxtrot.
Jeff, beautiful signal here today. Thank you for being with us. Whiskey 9 Foxtrot. Any additional check-ins?
34, that.
Okay, D4 is that check. Thank you for being here. Additional check-ins? Okay, well, thank you again for being here. This particular presentation at the museum was held during April and November of 2022. I believe the name of the house was the Anderson House, where it was held. The excellent exhibit was broken down to like 9 different areas. Some of them we're going to talk about in the context of other sources of research. But the way, if you get a chance to read their catalog, their document that describes the exhibit, they talked about the 9 areas being the scourge of smallpox, fighting disease, treating wounds and fractures, the hospital department, shipboard medicine, an ounce of prevention, diet, exercise, and a clean shirt, rituals of death and after the war. Some of those areas we're going to cover and some we're not, but as you can see, it wasn't always complicated. It could be just diet, exercise, and a clean shirt. But during the war, the Continental Congress authorized 1 surgeon to serve in each regiment. So the training for surgeons, for the most part, was apprentice-based. There were only 2 university-level programs, King's College in New York and one in Philadelphia. Those were precursors to Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. It was important back then in your education to have liberal arts knowledge, because Latin was important to be able to read texts and pharmacology. But unfortunately, surgeons had very little experience treating trauma back then. Of course, trauma was probably in the battlefield. One of the biggest risks, of course, those musket balls, one of our contributors talked about today. So before I continue on with the presentation, are there any questions that come to mind now that you would like to ask? Make your call to AA4FL. Okay, we'll have plenty of time for questions later. I'm not receiving any right now. But there were directions preserving the health of soldiers. There were recommendation considerations of officers of the Army of the United States from 1778. And that exhibit had a copy of the document. There were also registers of patients admitted to a Continental Army hospital. So there was some documentation as to what went on and what was being treated at the time. But how did they treat wounds and fractures? When we talk about trauma, I mean, what happened with simple fractures? How did they deal with complex fractures? I don't know if that's something that we really want to hear, although we have to hear. But I mean, simple fractures would be easy enough back then. They would just take the bone and reset it and stabilize it. They may go ahead and take some kind of stabilization, splint knuckle probably. So not too dissimilar to what we would have today, but of a more simplistic method and let people heal. But what about complex fractures? I mean, what was done for complex fractures? They didn't have a lot of history in treating trauma. Well, unfortunately, the answer back then was amputation. And they had special tourniquets to use that had actually screw tightness compression to keep them from bleeding out, where they tried to quickly do the amputations. They tried to do it within 3 minutes, probably 3 minutes of hell. We did not bite down on a bullet, obviously, if that's a misnomer. But usually it was some kind of cloth over wood or something soft enough that you could bite down on it, damage the teeth, and get a little bit of a way of expressing that stress. I mean, just the thought of it, we know in the Civil War, we certainly see that happened, right? I don't know if exactly the same kits were used in the Revolutionary War. They did have a picture of one of the kits. To me, it looked a little less extensive than the ones in the World War, in the Civil War, but my gosh, the number of battlefield injuries in the Civil War. I mean, here we're talking, in the 10,000 range. We're not talking about millions here. So, what a difference, but still nonetheless very significant. There are some videos that are online that are more simplistic in nature. The Jamestown museums, Yorktown museums, they do have a YouTube video, and you can search for that. It's Medicine During the American Revolution. You want to do a YouTube search for it. Let me pause one just to go here. In addition, in 18th century medicine, we have Revolutionary War medicine, battlefield surgery, amputation, and smallpox inoculation covered in another YouTube video. And these are not scientific in nature. This is for the general public. But you can search for that one. The name of the host is Bubble and George. It's from George Washington's Mount Vernon, basically. Those are worth a look for the general population here. It's not going to be scientific. And today's presentation, for the most part, is just geared as general information. And we don't really have a lot more statistics, or I did not see any available. There probably are. I'm not an academician in this area. And I would hope that you will find additional information and pass it on to me at my QRZ address, AA4FL, and we would be more than happy to add that information for next year's presentation. We thought it would be very important for those of you that are Markham members to be able to talk about the history of your families. So some of you are here on the net, and some are not. Now, if you're licensed, I've got your Zoom feed if you're coming in through Zoom, or you'll hear their audio off the net on the Zoom feed. So either way, we'll have some participation. I'm going to start with James Patterson, W8LJZ, who's a Markham member from Melvindale, Michigan, who has a fascinating Revolutionary War history. And James, just to let you know, I have images in the Zoom session that include the signed pay order for your great-grandfather. I'll let you explain the relation. But we also have a Facebook post that shows the area of the cemetery. And we have militia regiment lists that have him. And he was in Captain Abraham Meade's company. That listing was also there, but not to take away the presentation. I'm going to turn the mic over to W8LJZ. It's coming in here on our 20-meter net. Go ahead, James.
Okay, W8LJ, that's Dr. Wellington. Thank you very much. I appreciate that a great deal. Unfortunately, presentation-wise, I'm a little swift. It's been many years since I've done this, really, only lately with my daughter on the clothesline. And at any rate, the closest has come to Greenwich, Connecticut in 1620s, I think, or early 1630s, and helped found the town of Greenwich. I think it was Goodman Close from Gretna Parish in England. Revolutionary War. Old Darrell Close, which was his, I should suspect that he would be my 3 times great-grandfather. Odell Close was a descendant of Goodman Close. He was born in 1738. He was appointed in 1775 to the Committee of Inspection and Safety. Well, I delved into that a bit, and I thought it was to check arms and things like that for the coming revolution, but I guess one of his duties was to make expeditions throughout the county with others. They were spies. That's what they were doing. From what I read between the lines. But at any rate, he died in 1812. And 4 days later, his son died at 43. So he must have been profoundly affected by the father, or they could both have some sort of disease condition. I'm not sure on that. But I appreciate everything you've done, Jay, and I wish I had a better presentation for you. But at the moment, I do not. If you have any photographs or pictures that you've acquired, I'd appreciate getting them. So I'll turn it back to you. And sorry for the slim presentation on that. there's much more down the road. I see that my great grandfather was a Sarge captain at 18 on the Erie Canal in the 1840s. Well, he worked with his mule driver, James A. Garfield, and his carpenter, George Pullman, both who went on to do famous things. Not so much my grandfather, but he did, great grandfather, but he did become quite wealthy in the 1890s when he passed away. So I'll turn it back to you, Jay. AA4FL W8LJZ.
Fascinating, James. W8LJZ AA4FL. Net control for the Medical Amateur Radio Council of Grand Rounds in the Air Net, where we're talking about medicine in 1776 in the context of the Continental Army in honor of Independence Day. And as James just described, this is the first time we've talked about this subject as a group, and we're going to be building upon this start, and hopefully we'll have even a more expansive program next year. I do have a Zoom session running, and I'm using a PowerPoint, and as Jim mentioned, I had some images. I actually have 5 images, which I'm going to send to him. His family is very well documented, although I just focused on this one aspect. To have a future president involved as a worker with a family member and other famous people. It's just a fascinating story there, James. Thank you for being on here with us today, and for others that are going to be making presentations as well. So this Zoom session is being recorded. We'll convert it into a YouTube video and make it available to the general public. So for those of you that don't have access to the Zoom session, look for Jay Garlich's the Zoom channel, the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to access this video probably in about 2 days. Move on here to the next family member who's not able to be here with us today, Bob Conder, K4RLC. And Bob has been very active in Marco, often helps out with presentations in scientific subjects, including one that we recently did that will be appearing in the ether. But for his family, from the Daughters of the American Revolution website, it lists his great granddad, I'm not sure how many times over, 3rd or 4th granddad, who fought in the American Revolution. But in short, their family came from central London to the United States around 1760, landing in Philly. And they did get a land grant from King George for land in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where they were farmers. And that county is the county for Charlotte, North Carolina. And for those of you that watch TV, there's a series online on the air about Queen Charlotte. It's named after the king's young lady, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. It's a fascinating, partly fictional and partly historical program. If you ever get to watch it, it's sort of the background material for Bridgerton. If you like Bridgerton, you'll like that. But his granddad George was apparently not very appreciative to the crown, and he took up arms against it. And there's still lots of Condors in Mecklenburg County, including his son, who's a Ham Bobby, W4PRC. But if we go online to the Daughters of the American Revolution website, it confirms that his great-great-grandfather was a soldier, born circa 1745, died in 1799 in Washington County, Kentucky. And he did receive a Revolutionary War pay voucher. So I believe that they have a copy of that. And it seems to be a lot of people also received land. I'm not sure if that, because they already had a land grant in the family. But in other situations for other family members, that potential had occurred after the war as well, depending on where you fought and who you fought with. So hopefully next year, Bob will be with us and tell that story personally. So this is the Medical Amateur Radio Council of Grand Rounds in the Air for ID. This is AA4FL. This is a general conversation for the amateur population, general amateur population, and the overall population through the YouTube video we're going to do about medicine in 1776 in the context of the Revolutionary War. we encourage those that are going to have questions momentarily. We'll open up for questions to go ahead and check in. If you haven't already checked in, you can check in at this call. Make your call right now to AA4FL. Okay, Bill, KC9CS. I don't see where Bill is signed in through Zoom, because he does have a significant history too, as well, with his fourth great grandfather. Can we, Dave, KM2M, can you see if you can copy Bill KC9CS and just ask Bill if he has access to Zoom to make his presentation? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. I get
Okay, for some reason I'm getting an echo on your signal, Dave. I know you've got a presentation to do. I'm not sure why you're getting a feedback echo when you transmit. So maybe if you're listening to the volume on the Zoom, you might want to turn that volume down while you transmit over. Yeah, still getting the echo. I really was looking forward to your presentation. We got to find out why it's happening for you. It's not happening to anyone else. Dave, KM2M, AA4FL. But I'll go ahead and just talk about Bill, not knowing that he's got access to the Zoom feed. KC9CS, Bill's down here on the west coast of Florida. His fourth great grandfather, Isaac Dale, was born in 1751 in Farnham, Richmond County, Virginia. And in 1785 moved to Shenandoah County, Virginia. And then after the war, that is, and then also moved again a little bit later. And there's a history of that. And he did serve in the Warren County, Kentucky military service records in the Revolutionary War. There's a reference number. But he's one of those individuals that received a Revolutionary War Kentucky land grant of 200 acres in Barron County near Ben's CH, I don't know if that's a creek, surveyed in 1799. But he did pass away in July 1820 in Barron, Kentucky at the age of 69. His earliest ancestor arrived here in America, Nicholas Dale. He sailed on board the Jacob from London, England, arrived in February of 1624 as a 20-year-old, and he was an indentured servant for several years, sailing on the Charles River in North Durham Parish, Richmond County, Virginia. So Bill's proud to be an 11th generation colonialist, and thank you for offering that information, Bill. Dave, have we figured out you'd be up next here. Have we figured out the echo situation? KM2M, AA4FL.
I'm watching your video, but I have no microphone or speakers on the station. I'm listening to you on the radio. I don't know what else I can change except turn off the Zoom. Go ahead.
Okay, you're clear on your transmission now. No problem at all. So you're coming in through HF. And we do have a slide about your family business, Dave, and New Bedford whaling and the Roman Candle Works in that district in New Bedford, National Historic Park in Massachusetts. I'm going to let you talk all about that. And I have a question about your family. Did they take up arms? And if not, and what's the history in relation to your family in that respect? KM2M, AA4FL, go ahead.
But your AA4FL, KM2M. Well, I did some math since I talked to you the other day, and I am 11th generation here in the United States. My original ancestor was John Lawson. He's from Ireland. He was expelled in 1655, lived in Barbados, who had 4 children. I'm a descendant of Thomas Rodman, who was a physician trained in England. John had 2 sons. They both became physicians. They were both trained in England. And my ancestor was an obstetrician who practiced in Rhode Island and died in 1728. My ancestors were Quakers. They were pacifists. They did not believe in fighting in wars. So consequently, there's very little for me to say about the practice of a war in my family. However, I do know that numerous of my ancestors in the 2nd and 3rd generation were physicians in the colonies. This is KNTM. And I was able to locate some information on Gilbert Rodman. Now, Gilbert Rodman is not of my line. He would have been a great uncle. He was a Quaker and was expelled from his religion because of his insistence of fighting in the Revolutionary War. He came from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and Bucks County is west of Princeton and south of Allentown and north of Philadelphia. Kind of in the general area where Washington crossed the Delaware during the war. A lot of my family lived in that area, apparently. They owned large tracts of land. They were supposed to be very well-known, wealthy people. He fought in the Revolution. Another Rodman by the name of William was also in the Revolutionary War. Again, none of those, neither of those people I could find were on my direct line. My direct line went from a doctor in Rhode Island to a son doctor, to many, many other people. They eventually became farmers, and they lived in New York State, which is where I grew up, of course. Regarding the picture of that Rodman candle work, again, that was owned by Samuel Rodman, who again is not of my line, and he was into whaling and making candles. And they used the whale oil from the sperm whale to light the lamps, and that was common practice to use whale oil for lighting in the houses in New England well into the 1800s. And it became less common after petroleum was discovered in Pennsylvania, and also they eventually started to run on the whale. I did want to say something about the diseases during the Revolutionary War period. Smallpox is a huge issue. It started, the first epidemic was in the early 1720s when my ancestors had been practicing medicine. And they used in that time a technique called ingrafting, which is taking the pustular material from an infected patient and inoculating a recipient. This was done because it was discovered eventually that smallpox typically did not repeat itself in individuals. Once you had it, you really didn't do it again if you did it with a very, very, very benign course of the disease. And the smallpox fatality rate ranged from around 10% to over 80%, depending upon the time of the year and the people infected, their ages, and things like that. So that would have been a huge problem. As a matter of fact, Washington had a large part of his army inoculated for first smallpox in 1777 because it was such a huge problem. Well, that is the extent of my contribution. I'm sorry to say that my family, religious objections were largely not contributors to the Revolutionary War effort in the 1700s. However, they were prominent people apparently, and I do thank them for their beliefs and not best those beliefs. Perhaps I would not have been here today to tell you all about it. Anyway, so we thank God, and here we are. Back to you, Jay. And for us all, hands up.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. I tried to filter out some of the QRM here, but you're still coming through with a clear presentation. Dave, this is AA4FL for ID, by the way, with KN2M, the Medical Amateur Radio Council, Grand Rounds on the Internet. Do have a question, if you have any knowledge. I know you said your family were Quakers and religious reasons or not fight. Do you know the percentages of people that backed the crown versus as loyalists versus took up arms against the crown, and how many people percentages abstained or weren't involved in the fighting? Do you have any knowledge about that? Can to AA4FL.
Yes, at the time of the 1760s, about 40% of the colonial population were upset with the crown and were pro-American secession war. But 3% had really no skin in the game. That probably would have described my family. And about the remaining 40% were loyalists. They were Tories. And I just want to make one mention, even Benjamin Franklin, who is considered to be one of the prominent statesmen of the Revolutionary War period, was remembered on our country. In England, he spent 15 years spent in England prior to the Revolution before he was eventually expelled after the Boston Tea Party. And he was attempting to negotiate a continuance of the affiliation with the colonies with England up until the point of the British troops being sent over, and of course the massacre that happened in Boston. He was still in England up at that point, so he was very much a loyalist to the British government until the very few years prior to the Revolution, in which case he was he changed his political views pretty quickly. His son was actually an appointed governor to the colony of New Jersey for many years, which was, of course, a crown appointment, Jay. A4FL, KN2M.
Okay, thank you, Dave. KN2M, AA4FL. We appreciate the extra description there. I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm sure many of you have questions. You don't necessarily have to have the questions of me. If you have a question for Dave, KN2M, or any of the other presenters, W8, LJZ, or James, please go ahead and tell me if you have a question. I'll make a list who you want to ask the question of, and we'll proceed in that order. It's net control. This is AA4FL. Go ahead and I'll make that list now. Make the call. Okay, I'm not getting any requests for questions. Mary, did you want to ask a question by way of Zoom?
Yes, so I was wondering if you could unmute Dave Rodman from Zoom, because when it comes through the radio to Zoom, it's quite garbled. But since he's on Zoom also, if you unmuted him, would it be better?
Okay, that was AE4BX. Thank you. We could have done that before. He's made his presentation already. Dave, you want to go ahead and talk through Zoom for a minute? Just give a quick little summary, and so we can get that for individuals that that maybe didn't hear you. Why don't you go ahead and unmute your Zoom and speak through Zoom this time? KN2M AA4FL.
Yeah, I do not have a microphone on this computer to pick up my my audio. Go ahead.
Okay. Do you have the capability of transmitting on HF right now? Go ahead.
I am on HFJ.
Of course. I'm sorry. You don't have a computer to pick it up on the Zoom side. Mary, sorry about that. Just the HF feed. And you can tell you I'm getting confused at this point, trying to multitask. Thank you. There was a lot of QRM. Do you think, what Mary, was it the QRM that was the issue, or was it just the audio itself? Over.
I couldn't tell by Zoom, but there was a lot of garbling. You could occasionally get a word or two or a trend, but I would have liked to hear his whole presentation a little better.
Okay, well, thank you for the input. In the future, we'll have to make sure that we bring presenters in through Zoom to have the best possible. As long as they have an amateur radio license, I'll be more happy to be the control station and let them be a guest operator here and provide their audio. It's all within the FCC license abilities. Thank you for pointing that out, Mary. Any other questions from the HF side or from the Zoom side? Go ahead and make your call to AA4FL. Okay, nothing heard. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share here and stop the recording. Appreciate everybody being here with us today. We're going to make a